In the previous sections, you learned what an agency relationship is, who the parties are, and which fiduciary duties arise once representation exists. The next step is understanding the different forms that agency can take in real estate practice. Knowing whether you are in a single agency, dual agency, sub-agency, or no agency, transaction broker, relationship determines who you owe fiduciary duties to, the level of advocacy you can provide, and what disclosures and documents are required to comply with both national concepts and Arizona law. Across the country, real estate practice has evolved from the old everyone worked for the seller model into a variety of representation choices. Modern consumers expect clarity about who represents whom. Arizona adds another layer by requiring specific written disclosures, strict dual agency rules, and clear separation between representation, agency duties, and compensation, who pays the broker. This section connects the national forms of agency with practical Arizona applications. Single agency is the simplest and cleanest form of representation. In a single agency relationship, the broker represents only one party in the transaction, either the seller or the buyer, but not both. The client receives full fiduciary representation, including loyalty, obedience, confidentiality, disclosure, reasonable care, and accounting. The other party is treated as a customer who is owed honesty, fair dealing, and disclosure of known material defects, but not loyalty or advocacy. Seller agency is the traditional model. The seller, or landlord, is the principal, and the listing broker represents the seller's interests. The broker markets the property, advises on price and terms, presents all offers, and negotiates on behalf of the seller, always putting the seller's interest first within the boundaries of law and ethics. The buyer in this scenario is a customer and does not receive fiduciary-level advocacy from the listing broker. Buyer agency has grown dramatically in recent decades. Here, the buyer, or tenant, is the client and the owner is the customer. The buyer's broker searches for suitable properties, analyzes value, explains terms, negotiates the strongest possible terms for the buyer, and protects the buyer's confidential information and bargaining position. The listing broker represents the seller, the buyer's broker represents the buyer. Even though the buyer's broker may be paid from the listing site's commission, the fiduciary duties run to the buyer. In practice, the industry uses several terms. The listing broker is the firm that has the written listing with the seller. The individual licensee who took the listing is often called the listing agent. A broker who represents a buyer is the buyer's broker, and if they specialize in this role, they may refer to themselves as a buyer's broker or buyer representative. A broker or salesperson who represents tenants in leasing is often called a tenant rep. The buyer-broker exclusive employment agreement is Arizona's primary mechanism for establishing buyer agency. By signing this agreement, the buyer hires the broker to locate property and negotiate acceptable terms for a purchase, exchange, option, or lease. The agreement sets out how the broker will be compensated and often includes additional terms that clarify how commissions will be handled if the seller or builder does not offer cooperating compensation. Importantly, the buyer agrees to work exclusively with that broker and to have the broker accompany them on their first visit to model homes, new construction, open houses, or any other properties. This protects the broker's ability to be paid and avoids misunderstandings with builders and listing agents. The buyer-broker agreement also reminds buyers of Arizona's stigmatized property rules. Under Arizona law, sellers, lessors, and brokers are not obligated to disclose that a property was the site of a death, suicide, homicide, or other felony, that it was occupied by someone with HIV/AIDS or another non-occupancy transmissible disease, or that it is near a sex offender. The agreement includes a stigmatized property notice clarifying that the buyer may need to conduct independent investigations if that information is important to them. Because disputes sometimes arise, The buyer-broker agreement typically includes a dispute resolution clause. The parties first agree to mediate any disagreement. If mediation fails, they agree to binding arbitration. This approach keeps most disputes out of court and provides a clear path for resolution. Subagency. Subagency is an older form of agency that has been significantly reduced or eliminated in many jurisdictions. In a subagency relationship, the subagent is an agent of the broker who is already an agent of the client. The listing broker is the agent of the seller. Any cooperating brokers and many of their salespeople historically operated as subagents of the seller, even when they were the ones physically working with the buyer. By extension, subagents owed full fiduciary duties to the seller, not the buyer, which often confused consumers who assumed the agent helping me was on their side. Subagents can include outside co-brokers who cooperate with a listing broker through the MLS, and salespeople working under the listing broker who help locate a customer. Because subagents owe the same fiduciary duties to the principal as the listing broker, they must always place the seller's interests above those of the buyer, even when driving buyers around, discussing offers, or answering questions. This created a serious risk of undisclosed dual loyalties when buyers assumed those agents were representing them. Today, the industry has largely shifted away from automatic subagency toward clear buyer agency, seller agency, or in some cases, no agency transaction brokerage. Some states restrict or prohibit subagency altogether to reduce confusion about who is represented. Dual agency. Dual agency arises when a single broker represents both principal parties in the same transaction. This may occur when a buyer represented by the broker becomes interested in a property listed by that same broker, or when two agents working under the same designated broker each represent one side in the transaction. Whether dual agency exists depends on state law and how agency is defined at the brokerage level. Nationally, dual agency carries inherent conflicts of interest. A fiduciary must obtain the highest price and best terms for the seller, while also attempting to obtain the lowest price and most favorable terms for the buyer. These goals are directly opposed. For that reason, many states either ban dual agency or treat it as limited representation with severely restricted duties. In practice, a dual agent cannot fully advocate for either party the way a single agent could. In Arizona, dual agency is permitted but tightly regulated. The Arizona Department of Real Estate's commissioner's rules state that a licensee may not represent both parties to a transaction without the prior written consent of both parties. A failure to obtain informed written consent can result in disciplinary action under ARS Section 322153 for acting for more than one party without knowledge or consent of all parties. A dual agent must still exercise reasonable skill and care, deal honestly with both buyer and seller, and disclose in writing information that materially and adversely affects consideration. However, the dual agent must not advocate or negotiate on behalf of one party over the other, or disclose confidential information that would give one party an advantage. Examples of prohibited disclosures include the buyer's willingness to pay more, the seller's willingness to accept less, or detailed motivation and bottom line positions, unless both parties give informed written authorization. To manage dual agency properly, Arizona practitioners use the Consent to Limited Representation form. This document identifies buyer, seller, broker, and subject property, then explains that the broker will represent both parties with limited duties. The parties acknowledge that conflicts exist in the duties of loyalty, obedience, disclosure, and confidentiality, and that confidential information will not be shared without written consent. The form also clarifies that legal obligations to disclose known material facts still apply, and that stigmatized property categories are not required disclosures under ARS. Section 32-2156. Dual agency must be explained and consented to before the offer is sent, not after. This is crucial to avoid undisclosed dual agency. When writing an offer on your own listing or on a listing within your own brokerage, you must have all parties sign the consent before submission. If you wish to avoid a dual agency situation, alternatives include allowing the buyer to remain unrepresented, while you walk a very careful line not to provide them advice, or referring the buyer to another brokerage so each side can have full representation. Implied or undisclosed dual agency can arise when a listing agent begins offering advice, negotiation strategies, or confidential assurances to a buyer who is actually a customer, not a client. If the buyer shares confidential information and the agent promises to keep it secret without making clear that they represent the seller, the agent risks accidentally creating a second agency relationship and violating fiduciary duties owed to the seller. For this reason, it is critical to use proper agency disclosure forms, such as the READE form, and clarify roles early in the relationship. No agency, transaction brokerage, and facilitation. A newer model in many jurisdictions is transaction brokerage or facilitation, sometimes referred to as no agency. In this structure, the broker does not represent either party as a fiduciary. Instead, the broker facilitates the transaction, helps complete paperwork, presents offers, coordinates tasks, and ensures that both parties are informed, but does not advocate for one side over the other. The duties of a transaction broker generally include accounting for all money and property, exercising reasonable skill and care, dealing honestly and fairly, presenting all offers promptly, assisting in closing, keeping both parties informed, recommending expert advice when needed, and disclosing known material facts that affect value. However, because there is no agency, the transaction broker does not owe undivided loyalty, cannot provide confidential advocacy, and is not required to inspect or verify information solely for the benefit of either party. Some states have formalized this role in statute, requiring written disclosure and consent, similar to dual agency. Arizona has not adopted a pure transaction broker model, but does recognize situations where a consumer may remain unrepresented while the licensee still owes duties of fairness, honesty, and disclosure. The key is that fiduciary duties attach only where an agency relationship exists, not in a facilitation-only scenario. No sub-agency. To reduce confusion about who represents whom, some states have moved toward a no sub-agency structure. Instead of automatically making cooperating brokers sub-agents of the seller, the system shifts to clear buyer or seller representation. An agent showing a property either represents the buyer directly through a buyer-broker agreement or is the listing agent representing the seller. Compensation can still flow from the seller's side, but the agency relationship is separate from who pays the commission. For practitioners, this clearer structure helps avoid undisclosed dual agency and aligns representation with consumer expectations. Buyers who assume, "my agent is on my side," are far less likely to be misled when the industry avoids blanket sub-agency and uses explicit buyer-broker employment agreements. Arizona practice considerations. Real-world Arizona practice overlays these national concepts with specific forms and disclosures. If you are writing on your own listing or another listing within your brokerage, you must consider whether dual agency will arise, and if so, secure informed written consent before sending the offer. When dealing with FSBO properties, you may need an unrepresented seller compensation agreement signed before presenting an offer, clarifying your role and how you will be paid. For limited service listings where the MLS instructions direct you to present offers directly to the seller, a disclosure of buyer agency and seller waiver and confirmation must be in place at first contact. Beyond agency form, you must still fulfill your fiduciary duties of obedience, loyalty, and disclosure to your client. Even if you disagree with the price or terms your buyer wants to offer, you must submit the offer as instructed, provided it is legal and ethical. Agency form does not change basic fiduciary obligations. It defines who receives them and how far they extend. Review summary. In this section, you explored the primary forms of real estate agency and how they interact with fiduciary duties and Arizona-specific requirements. Single agency, whether seller or buyer representation, provides the cleanest form of advocacy because the broker owes undivided loyalty, confidentiality, and full representation to just one client. Buyer agency has grown as consumers expect their own advocate, and Arizona's buyer-broker agreement clarifies exclusive representation, compensation, stigmatized property rules, and dispute resolution. You reviewed subagency, where cooperating brokers and salespeople historically acted as agents of the listing broker, and by extension, the seller. This model often confused buyers and has been restricted or eliminated in many jurisdictions in favor of clear buyer and seller agency roles. Dual agency was examined as an inherently conflicted structure in which one broker represents both buyer and seller in the same transaction. Arizona permits dual agency only with prior informed written consent, using tools like the Consent to Limited Representation form, and restricts the licensee from advocating for one side at the expense of the other, or sharing confidential information without authorization. You also studied the transaction broker or facilitator model, where no agency exists and the broker assists both parties without fiduciary loyalty, and how some states have moved toward a no sub-agency world in which agents either represent buyers or sellers directly. Throughout, Arizona practice points highlighted the importance of proper agency disclosure, avoiding undisclosed dual agency, using appropriate FSBO and limited services forms, and remembering that representation and compensation are separate issues. Together, these concepts prepare you to identify the form of agency in any transaction, comply with legal and ethical requirements, and explain to clients exactly who you represent and what duties you owe.